So Ford Smith was a great ball player. He's only 17 years old at this time. But he would go on to pitch for the Kansas City Monarchs in 1941. Career is interrupted by the war, but then he goes on and he plays for the Monarchs again, and then also down with some Caribbean teams. And he and Monty Irvin are the first two African Americans to be signed in the New York Giants organization. And he's the first African American pitcher. Unfortunately, he becomes injured and he doesn't make it to the big leagues. But he returns home, and he becomes the first chairman of the Civil Rights Commission here in Phoenix. And he pursues a career in politics as well. Ran for state office in 1966. So, and you can see this original advertisement in the exhibit as well. He didn't win, by the way. Can't win them all. So which leads us to the 1940s. So the Black Broncos, they get a new sponsor. It's the Arizona Compress and Warehouse Factory. They process cotton. And they do represent Arizona. They go to Wichita. Two great ball players here in this team are Tommy G and Leon Sugar Westeros. I talked to some of the players who played against Sugar, and they said that he had a lot of style on the field, a lot like Ricky Henderson in the way that he approached the game. And what a great nickname, Sugar. All right. So I wanted to point out where the Arizona Compress Warehouse is, just right around the corner from East Lake Park, excuse me. And this is where it comes back into the story, or segues back in with Japanese Americans. So in 1942, well, 1941, the U.S. goes to war. 1942, the United States sends over 120,000 Japanese Americans to internment camps across the United States. And 13,000 are sent to Gila River, Arizona. And there's Zenemira first with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig in the 20s. And here he is in the 1940s with his two sons, Howard and Harvey, in Arizona, behind barbed wire. So the first thing he does is he builds a baseball field to bring a sense of normalcy and joy to the community. And the field opens up in March of 1943. And it can seat up to 7,000 people. And he charges admission, and it's quite a lucrative fundraiser, but also it really helps bring the community together as well. And Zenemira is reading in the Arizona Republic about all these great teams on the outside, and he starts inviting them in. And one of the teams he invites in is a lot of the players from the Compress team. So this actually says big ball game in the camps, Arizona champions coming. So Zenemira creates a team he calls the Gila River All-Stars. It's just a pickup team. And they play against a lot of the players from the Arizona Compress team who come into the camps, except they've added a new player named Cornell Fisher. Cornell Fisher is a great multi-sport athlete out of Mesa, Arizona. Played football, ran track, and here he is playing baseball as well. So the Japanese Americans end up winning the game 11-3, but it turns out the score isn't really what's important here. So I had a chance to interview Kenzo Zenemira, the gentleman who's batting down on the bottom. He was 16 years old when they played. He said the Compress team came into the camp and they approached the game with a lot of flair and entertainment and style, almost like the Harlem Globetrotters. So they were catching the ball behind their back, playing shadow ball. Really brought a lot of joy to those who were behind barbed wire at that time. So it's a really touching moment in history. In fact, I think this may be the only point in maybe world history where you have an all-black team playing against an all-Japanese team in the middle of an Indian reservation, at least here in Arizona. So a pretty rare occurrence. That's Cornell Fisher jumping up in the air there. I had a chance to interview his son, and he was telling me he remembers when his dad came home from this game. Because all the players, Zenemira ensured that win or lose, they would get 70% of the gate receipts, so all the players got paid. And he came home with a small pig that he had purchased from the Japanese-American hog farm, and they raised it, and they ate it years later. But he remembers that story. That was pretty cool. So Sugar Westeros would go on to continue his professional career. He played briefly in the 1946 West Coast Negro League Baseball Association. He played for the LA White Sox. And his son was Marvin Westeros. Marvin was one of the first African-American players to help integrate the ASU basketball program. And that's Coach Bill Kajikawa up on the top. I thought it was interesting that there was a Japanese-American connection there as well. Bill was instrumental in integrating the football and basketball programs at ASU. Oh, by the way, his daughter is Kathy Wilkinson, the vice president of ASU. So 1943 takes us back to Fort Huachuca, and we have Rube Foster Field being dedicated down near the border. My understanding is that there was some unrest, if you will, with the soldiers, and so they had requested that they honor an African-American pioneer, and so Rube Foster was who they honored with the field there. That's Sarah Foster, Rube's wife, who came to Arizona, and we have Lena Horne, who visited as well. So the ball field was wonderful back then, but unfortunately no longer exists. But I think it may have been the only Rube Foster field that was ever created. So that's pretty interesting that that occurred here in Arizona. And finally, the Conquest team rebrands, and by 1946, they're calling themselves the Broadway Honey Drippers. And actually, some of the music that I was playing earlier was by Joe Liggins and the Honey Drippers. And Honey Dripper apparently is a term for a smooth talker. So I didn't know that. But that's pretty cool that they renamed their team the Honey Drippers. And in 1947, the local white teams follow the lead of Branch Rickey and the Brooklyn Dodgers, and they start to integrate as well. So the Phoenix Thunderbirds invite Ford Smith and catcher Tom G to join their team. And then the last team I could find was the 1948 Reddy's Corners Boosters. Reddy's Corners was a liquor store. I think it's still in the Phoenix area, maybe a few locations. But Reddy Fritsch was the sponsor there. And some of these players on this team were the ones who went into the camp as well. Let me double check my notes just to make sure I get some of the names. So we have, there's an Alfred Harris, a Buddy Fultz, and Ted Williams was the ball player named Ted Williams. But it's not that Ted Williams, the Hall of Fame outfielder. And Charlie's going to be discussing Ted here in a little bit and his connections to Arizona. So in the late 40s, we see a shift in the black community from baseball to fast pitch softball. So some of the top players here, we have Bob Tate, Garfield Ham, Bobby Freeman, Charlie Hemphill, and Lloyd Boyd. Cornell Fisher and Bobby Freeman, and a female pitcher by the name of Billy Harris would go on to be inducted into the Arizona Softball Hall of Fame, which is up in Prescott. And I will close my presentation with the Arizona connections to the 1946 Negro League World Series between the Newark Eagles and the Kansas City Monarchs. So the 1946 Monarchs included Ford Smith and Buck O'Neill, who we'll be talking more about later. And the Newark Eagles were led by Biz Mackey there in the front. It included Monty Irvin and Larry Doby, circle here. So here's the situation. It gets to Game 7, and Ford Smith goes into the 8th inning, and the Kansas City Monarchs are winning 2-1. Unfortunately, he walks Larry Doby, and he walks Monty Irvin, and the next player hits the game-winning double, and they lose 3-2. Well, good for Larry Doby. There you are, for the Newark Eagle fans out there. But not so good for Ford Smith. But in fairness to him, he was the top performing pitcher in this World Series. Satchel Paige did play for the team, but he did not do as well as Ford Smith. Just lady luck was with the Newark Eagles that day. But a year later, Larry Doby would sign with the Cleveland Indians and join Jackie Robinson as the first two African Americans in Major League Baseball. So with that, that is a good segue to the Cactus League. And I will let Charlie bring you up to 1947, up to, how far are we going to go? 2019?
We're going to keep it
back there?
In the past.
All right. Hey, while we're in a transition, just let people know, out the door, to the right is the men's restroom, to the left is the women's restroom, and you can feel free to get up and walk out at any time. We'll keep it going. So you take that. We good? All right.
Hello, everybody. What a pleasure it is to be here in this historic building. My first time here, and learning all about it from Bill, and the history of the place is really cool. I also think it's neat that we're kind of in the shadow of Chase Field here. I passed the ballpark on my way in and I said, oh, geez, we're so close to the big league ballpark too today. So it really felt like a baseball occasion as I was pulling into town. My presentation is on the Cactus League and the integration of spring training in Arizona, which also led to the integration of a lot of institutions in Arizona. It wasn't just baseball, but baseball really served as an impetus, and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today. So, nearly 20 years before the Civil Rights Act was passed into law, the presence of players like Larry Doby, Monty Irvin, Willie Mays, and Ernie Banks on major league rosters helped accelerate the integration process in Arizona. All four of these crossover players from the Negro leagues can be seen as forerunners in the civil rights movement, and their participation in the major leagues with players in Arizona during spring training in the seasons of the late 1940s and the early 1950s marked some of the earliest interaction among black and white major leaguers. The integration of Major League Baseball during spring training season in Arizona brought the integration of social institutions such as bars and restaurants. Black and white major leaguers worked and socialized and in some cases lived together in Phoenix, Tucson, Scottsdale, and Mesa before they did so anywhere else. In conjunction with Jackie Robinson breaking Major League Baseball's racial barrier in 1947, Arizona's Cactus League also celebrated its 70th anniversary a couple of years ago in 2017. And the aforementioned pioneering African-American players were inducted into the Cactus League Hall of Fame that year. The Cactus League Hall of Fame has been in existence since about 2008, and in 2017 was the first year they ever inducted players into the Hall of Fame. Most of the inductions for the Cactus League Hall of Fame before that had to do with the founders of the league itself. So the first group of players that was ever put in the Cactus League Hall of Fame were all African-American players who also played in the Negro leagues. Here you see let me click it over. Here you see labor union demonstrators in New York City lobbying for the rights of African-American ball players as early as 1940. So this is 7 years before Jackie actually broke the color barrier. There were plenty of people who thought this should have been happening already, and largely because of the participation of African Americans in World War II and even World War I. They thought by this time, why aren't they playing ball also at the same time in the major leagues? In the spring of 1947, prior to Jackie Robinson's first year in the major leagues, the Dodgers went down to Havana, Cuba for spring training. They thought that would be a good place to break Jackie in rather than the traditional Florida spring training. Here's Bill Veeck. Bill Veeck was the owner of the Cleveland Indians, but previously the owner of the St. Louis Browns. And if you know anything about Bill Veeck, he was kind of a great promoter, kind of a carnival-like atmosphere in a lot of what Bill Veeck did. And here he is. You can see him handing out beer to fans. One of his sponsors was Falstaff Beer, and he's just getting them some juice by giving the beer away in the grandstands. Here he is. Bill Veeck was a funny thing about Bill Veeck. He really was not the typical baseball owner. You see him here out with no shirt on in the bleachers, drinking with the fans. He had a great Bill Veeck quote comes to mind, that he always thought the level of intelligence of baseball fans was in inverse proportion to how much they paid to get into the game. So he always preferred to sit out in the bleachers with the real fans. Here's Bill Veeck signing Larry Doby to his first major league contract. Everybody knows Jackie Robinson was the first black player in the major leagues. Not as many people know that Larry Doby was right behind him, just by a few weeks. And everything that Jackie Robinson experienced in 1947 Larry Doby also experienced just a little bit later. And there was no interleague play back then, so Robinson was kind of alone in the National League, and Doby was basically alone in the American League for quite some time as well. This is Effa Manley. Effa Manley, the owner of the Newark Eagles. This is her Hall of Fame plaque. Effa Manley was the first and still the only woman recognized by the National Baseball Hall of Fame. She was inducted back in 2006 with a group of Negro Leagues players that were selected by a Negro Leagues committee. It was one of the, I think it was the largest induction ever at the Hall of Fame. 16 people went in that year, 16 or 17, I can't remember the exact number. I want to read what it says here. So what Effa Manley did, let me move over. Doby was already a bona fide star, veteran of the Negro National League's Newark Eagles, and he was hitting .415 with 14 home runs and 35 RBIs when Vec purchased his contract from the Eagles co-owner and business manager Effa Manley for a total of $15,000. $10,000 for pulling him off the roster, and an additional $5,000 contingent on whether or not he played with the Indians for at least 30 days. Manley, the only woman enshrined in the Baseball Hall of Fame, established a precedent for Negro Leagues teams of receiving compensation for players signed to Major League contracts. Doby, who had played in the 1946, which we just saw, Negro League, National League, and All-Star team, and led the Eagles to the 1946 Negro League World Series Championship with a .341 batting average, was informed of his sale between games of a doubleheader. Manley reportedly told Vec, if Larry Doby were white, you'd have to give him a $100,000 signing bonus. So really, he got quite a deal getting Larry Doby for just $15,000. Here they are in spring training in Tucson. So in the spring of '48, even though Doby joined the team in '47, he didn't do spring training with them, and it was the middle of the season in '47. So in the spring of '48, Doby joined the Cleveland Indians and his teammates at Randolph Municipal Baseball Park, later High Corbett Field, which is still down there where the U of A plays their games in Tucson, and found that while it may have been more hospitable than Florida, segregation was still prevalent in the region at the time. Here's what High Corbett Field would have looked like back then. You see all those period automobiles. It's a great shot. I was kind of sad when they lost spring training down at High Corbett Field. I always loved going down for the Tucson road trip, but the Indians were there for quite some time, from 1947 to 1992, and now U of A uses this field. Here is the Santa Rita Hotel in Tucson. At Tucson, this is Bill Vec talking, I discovered the bleachers weren't segregated, but the hotel was. We weren't able to talk the management into allowing Larry to stay with us in his first year. Although we did make it clear, and they agreed that in the future, they would take all of our players, regardless of race, creed, or previous condition of servitude. The future Vec spoke of would not come until 1954, the same year as the landmark Brown v. Board of Education at Topeka Supreme Court case, declaring separate but equal state laws to be unconstitutional, ordering the integration of public schools with deliberate speed. So it took 6 years for Larry Doby to be able to actually stay in the same hotel with his teammates down in Tucson. So, in the meantime, in those 6 years, Doby stayed with the family of Chester Willis, a black foreman for the company that supplied the Santa Rita Hotel with its clean sheets and towels at his home in Tucson's Dunbar School District, where the city's African-American children attended a segregated school. He lived 1 block away from Dunbar. That's where his social life existed, and the rest of us as well, said Morgan Maxwell of Tucson, son of Morgan Maxwell Sr. This book tells the story, it was written by Morgan Maxwell, of the Dunbar neighborhood in Tucson. I don't know if anybody's ever been down there. Dunbar was not integrated yet. I was living in Tucson, and downtown wasn't integrated yet. I was living in Tucson in 1948, and Larry was part of the neighborhood. Dunbar neighborhood is very small. It's just a couple of blocks, and it's right off the historic downtown area in Tucson, but that's where Dobie lived. This is the house. So this was Chet Willis's house. Dobie and the other black players to follow shared space in the Willis's 5-bedroom house. The family who had an agreement with the Indians to provide breakfast and dinner, and accommodated the players by having the children sleep outside. Their own children slept outside while the players slept inside. Sleeping on the back porch was fun. It was like camping out, said Chester Willis's daughter, Dolores Willis Townsend, in an interview for the book. Legendary Negro Leagues pitcher Satchel Paige also stayed in the Willis house. My parents gave him their bedroom and took turns sleeping on the porch, Townsend said. The home at 932 Adler Avenue was a gathering place as neighbors would sit on the U-shaped porch and Paige would regale them with his stories. He was always telling stories, laughing and telling stories. Nobody ever asked for autographs. They just talked about growing up, food, being on ball teams, Townsend said. The house is now owned by Chet Chambers, a self-described baseball fanatic who was unaware of the home's unique history. It was funny. I went down there to find this place, and I went to the Tucson Historical Society, and I met an author of a History of Tucson book, and he showed me how to look through the old register and find places. And when I got to the address out of the book, we just took a drive right over there, and we showed up in front of the guy's house, and we started taking pictures of the place. And he came out the front door and kind of said, "Can I help you? What's going on here?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if you know this, but you live in a pretty historic place." And the guy was a big baseball fan. He said, "What?" And I said, "Well, Larry Dobie lived here, and Satchel Paige lived here when they couldn't stay at the hotel with the team in Tucson." And he was amazed to find this out. And I think someday, it hasn't been done yet, but I think there should be a historic marker placed on this house. And that's what we were talking about when he's looking at the place in the picture. We said, we should put a plaque up here somewhere and get some recognition. There's another shot of Satchin in his windup, not as high kicking as the other shots, but that is at High Corbett Field in Tucson. In his first full season with Cleveland, Dobie proved instrumental to the team's success, and the Indians won the 1948 World Series. First full year with the team, right to the World Series. He wins the Negro League World Series in 1946. Joins the Indians in the middle of 47, and 48, he's right back on top again. Dobie's .318 batting average for the series was the highest among the Indian starters, and he hit the game-winning home run in the team's 2-1 Game 4 victory. Pitcher Steve Gromick and Alfredo Larry Dobie celebrate after the 1948 World Series Game 4 win. This is a drawing of the very famous picture of Dobie and Gromick. It's on the cover of Jim Odenkirk's book over here. And the picture was more rewarding and happy for me than actually hitting the home run. It was such a scuffle for me after being involved in all that. Segregation, going through all I had to go through. Until that picture. The picture finally showed a moment of a man showing his feelings for me. But the picture is not just about me. It shows what feelings should be, regardless of differences among people. And it shows what feelings should be in all of life, not just in sports. I think enlightenment can come from such a picture. That's Dobie talking about, that shot himself. Larry Dobie was named the second black manager in the major leagues with the Chicago White Sox in 1978. So, poor Larry Dobie, he's always the second guy, and it's always behind a guy named Robinson. So he was behind Jackie Robinson first, and then he was behind Frank Robinson second when he became the manager. He was in the running for Robinson's job in Cleveland as well. It was kind of between those two before Frank Robinson got the job. And there is Frank Robinson. Frank became the first major league manager and first black manager in baseball in 1974, and this picture again is taken down at High Corbett Field. His baseball card, the shop, was taken down there in Tucson. Here's a shot of Monty Irvin and Larry Doby together in 1946. They were both on that 1946 Negro League World Series team. And here, 2 years before Willie Mays joined the Giants, former Negro League All-Star outfielder Monty Irvin made his big league debut in 1949 and was also locked out of the team's Adams Hotel. Eventually, the Giants were able to persuade the operators of the hotel to reconsider its policy of segregation. I learned something in Bill's presentation about those barbers who founded the team, that they were actually in the Adams Hotel. So here you have the one league being formed in this hotel while it's also still keeping guys like Monty Irvin out. One of the first African-American players signed by the Giants, outfielder Monty Irvin, was also among the first 6 players to integrate spring training baseball in Arizona. He made his major league debut in July of 1949, joining the Giants in Phoenix the following spring. By the time he arrived in the majors, Irvin was already a 4-time All-Star in the segregated Negro Leagues and a 2-time Negro National League batting champion, hitting .395 in 1941 and .406 or .404 in 1946. Tremendous. Leading the Newark Eagles to the pennant and Negro League World Series championship after returning from 3 years of military service during World War II. Monty Irvin is an amazing person and I think a kind of an underrated ball player. I don't think people realize how great Monty Irvin was and all of what he did in his life. His story doesn't get told quite the same way that some of these other guys do. So this is what the Adams Hotel in Phoenix looked like back then. Now it's the Renaissance Hotel. It's still right where it was. It looks similar to, it doesn't quite look as ornate as it used to, but it's still there. This is Monty Irvin talking. We Negro Giants desegregated the Adams Hotel at our spring training base in Phoenix. At first, the dining room and swimming pool was closed to us. Phoenix was then almost completely segregated city, said Irvin in Jackie Robinson's 1964 book, Baseball Has Done It. Monty Irvin is here with his daughter Patricia at the Grand Canyon in Arizona. She told me, I got a hold of her on the phone, and she told me they used to drive across the country for spring training and stop at places like the Grand Canyon before the season started. My mother and sister and I would go out to spring training with Dad and drive from New Jersey to Arizona, said Irvin's daughter Patricia, adding, I was just so young. I think I didn't really understand the relevance of what he was doing. It was a phenomenal time that Dad lived in. They say there are no extraordinary men, just people who lived in extraordinary times, but he was extraordinary. He was really special. So at the Hall of Fame ceremony, the Cactus League Hall of Fame ceremony in 2017, Monty, of course, was not alive to receive his plaque, but Patricia, the girl in that same picture, did show up, and I was fortunate enough to sit at the same table with her during the ceremony and get a nice shot with her right after she accepted the plaque. Here's Rendezvous Park in Mesa. This is the spring training home of the Chicago Cubs. They've been in Mesa for a while. They go back and forth, Mesa, Scottsdale, Catalina Island. They were all over the place, but they were in Rendezvous Park for quite some time. Here's a postcard shot of the ballpark. They were the third team to move their spring training operation to Arizona. From the beginning, it was just the Giants and the Indians from 1947 until 1952 when the Cubs showed up. They had previously been out on Catalina Island, which was owned, the whole island was owned by Philip K. Wrigley, the owner of the Cubs. So I think that spring training on Catalina Island was more of a party than actually spring training from what I've heard about it. They were all by themselves out there, and I don't think they took it quite as serious. I think when they got into Arizona and started to have to play against the Giants and the Indians, it became a little bit more of a real deal. So here's Ernie Banks with the Kansas City Monarchs in 1953. He's in there somewhere. And Banks was the first black player signed by the Cubs, previously playing for the Kansas City Monarchs in the Negro American League, where Jackie Robinson and Satchel Paige also played.